sorry, ladies and gentlemen, you actually get to hear from me first. So, good afternoon, welcome back to the Future Leaders Summit. I'm Ashley Godwin, and I'm Deputy Editor of the Rusi Journal and a Fulbright Scholar in National Security Policymaking. It's a privilege to represent the UK here at the Future Leaders Summit, and also a pleasure to introduce this first session after lunch, A View from Parliament, NATO's Role in the World. We're extremely fortunate today to have three distinguished British members of Parliament with us, all of whom sit on the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. They are also representatives of the three main political parties at Westminster. Our first speaker, Hugh Bailey, has been the president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly since November 2012, having first joined the UK delegation in 1997. In that time, he has performed many roles within the Assembly, including General Rapporteur and the Chairman of the Economics and Security Committee. Within the UK government, he has been a member of the International Development Select Committee since 2001, and he has represented his constituency in York as a Labour MP since 1992. Joining Mr. Bailey is Sir Ming Campbell, the leader of the UK's delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He has long been a strong voice in the British foreign and security affairs, as a former leader of the Liberal Democrat Party and as a member of several House of Commons select committees. He is currently a member of the Commons Select Committee on Foreign Affairs and of Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee. The Liberal Democrat MP for North East Fife since 1987, Sir Ming's service to the UK government has been recognised through numerous awards, including a knighthood in 2004, and not forgetting the Herald's Award in the same year for being the best Scottish MP at Westminster. The final member of the panel is Tobias Ellwood, a member of the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. In his varied career, Mr. Ellwood has been the Conservative MP for Bournemouth East since 2005. He has also served in the British Army, in which he remains a reservist, and more recently has studied at Harvard. I'd like to congratulate Mr. Ellwood on his recent appointment to the position of Permanent Under-Secretary of State at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and also to thank him for serving as the British Prime Minister's advisor for this NATO summit. The only thing left for me to do, of course, is to introduce our moderator for this session, known to most of us by now, Dr. Fran Burwell, the Vice President of the Atlantic Council and Director of the Programme on Transatlantic Relations. Her areas of expertise include US-EU relations and the development of the EU's defence and foreign policies. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers and moderators to the stage. Thank you.
Anywhere over here. I've been told to sit here. So thank you very much, Ashley. Welcome, everyone. And I know it's sometimes tough to get restarted after lunch, but we're going to give you plenty of ammunition and excitement up here on the panel. I want to also acknowledge the rest of the delegation. These are not the only MPs who are here. So thank you all very much for coming. This session is about a parliamentary view of NATO, and I think it is especially important to engage parliaments because this alliance is not just about governments, prime ministers and presidents. It is about our people. And the members of this alliance are democracies. And really, it is the parliaments, the legislatures in all our countries who are the true representatives of the people. The alliance and the consensus within the alliance is only sustainable as long as that consensus is shared by our citizens. Some of the key issues to be discussed at this summit are certainly subject to parliamentary discussion and approval. For example, we've talked a bit about the increase in defense budgets for those who are not yet at 2% of GDP. But I think also one of the challenges we face, and General Breedlove referred to this morning, is the ideological element of the challenge that we face. And it is in part, I think, parliamentarians who are best at reaching out to our citizens and discussing these issues in a way that can be understood outside the foreign policy community. So what I thought I would do is to start with Tobias Ellwood, who is more or less the head of this delegation in his role, and then go to Hugh Bailey and Ming Campbell, and ask them each for what they think the most important challenge to the alliance is right now, or the most important challenge to the West, the transatlantic partnership is right now. What is NATO's relevance to that? and to say how they would say this to their constituents, how they would say this in a way that will counteract some of the things that we have been hearing over the last few months. So, Tobias, let me start with you.
Well, firstly, can I just say thank you very much indeed for inviting us to join you here today. We've seen the program that you're going through today, and it's very impressive indeed. So it's a pleasure to participate in that. You mentioned that we're with some other MPs. It would be absolutely wrong of me not to introduce them as well, not least because if we can't ask the questions, then there are some huge experts here as well. Rory Stewart is here, who's, I think, well known to many of you, and he is now chairman of the Defence Select Committee. Nadeem Sahawi is on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and then we have Di Harvard, who's on the Defence Select Committee, along with Madeleine Moon, Defence Select Committee, and then Mike Gapes, Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I think former chairman of the committee as well, and Andrew Rosendale, who's our expert in sort of Commonwealth affairs, if I can put it that way as well, on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. So we're all here really trying to support what you are doing, the engagement that you are encouraging to allow NATO to be better understood outside the confines of the 28 heads of nations is so important. We've all just come from a school, a wonderful school, Newport High, where we engaged with the children. You've got to remember that these children that we saw, the students, very engaging, lots of questions, but they've not experienced the Cold War. They've not had the chance to sit on, in fact, their grandfather probably, who actually endured the horrors of the Second World War. So young are they. You know, talk about Margaret Thatcher. That is history to them as such. And to recognize that the security that we enjoy largely today is not a given, but it has to be worked on because of organizations such as NATO, as well as the other Bretton Woods organizations, if I call them that, is so important. That can only happen if we engage with the public. And that can only happen if we then engage in parliamentarians who are not foreign affairs and defense experts and take an interest in this. And that was articulated so much in the debate, in the vote on Syria. You'll remember we were recalled back to Parliament a year ago, and we had not a lot of time, if I recall, to make a judgment on whether or not there should be a punitive strike. Britain should contribute to that. Now, many of us, as I say, who live and breathe defence and foreign affairs matters, follow these things in great detail, and therefore we're able to appreciate what was the situation of what was at hand. But I think it's fair to say, and others, MPs may differ, but many of our colleagues who don't necessarily specialise in foreign affairs matters were haunted by our involvement in Iraq and indeed Afghanistan, were worried about what was going to happen, and a nation was as well. Are we stepping back in to another situation that we can't get ourselves out of? And therefore the vote went against the executive. So that underlines the important roles that parliamentarians must engage in, not least with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where for the first time ever we have copied you in actually having an event which takes place around the summit time. Now, you've done better than us in the sense that you're inside the wire here. You're well done for doing that, and congratulations. And we had our event up in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on Tuesday, but it was the first time that NATO, the Parliamentary Assembly, had met at the same time as the summit itself. And so that message, that communication with the public is so important indeed.
And so what do you think is the most important
No, I cleverly avoided that bit, didn't I?
Yeah.
I think stepping back, I mean, I've just come back from, you mentioned my responsibility, which is Middle East and North Africa, and I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, not least in Iraq. And I think the concern I have for NATO is how does it deal with these issues which aren't directly in its patch, but are affecting us in our country. It's a Brit, very sadly, that has been involved with the horrendous murder of James Foley and the second one as well. So there is an extremism that is embedding itself in different countries across Europe, and that needs to be challenged. And the role that NATO can actually do in recognizing the military consequences of that and how it provides that support, how it's invited to provide that support, how it actually deals with that as a consensus, as a policy, as a strategy, is something that I hope is something that this summit will actually start to consider. The idea of the Sunni, moderate Sunnis having a voice, to be articulated and supported, I think is so important and needs to be is one of the biggest challenges that face us, not bearing in mind, not least, is that this is all happening on the very corner of NATO territory, just south of Turkey.
Right. And I think even with Ukraine, we see NATO territory and a little bit outside. And it becomes a balancing act, and one that I'm not sure that all our citizens understand in terms of who's in and who's out. But Hugh, I want to ask you the same question. First, I want to point to the good work of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly over many years, and particularly what I recall best is after 1989, when you had all these free parliaments suddenly in Central Europe, and it took parliamentarians from the NATO countries to teach them how to act like parliaments in a democracy that had to report or oversee defense budgets, and things of those types of things that have to be learned and taught and discussed. So what do you see now as the biggest challenge for the alliance?
For the alliance, I see the biggest challenge, two words, President Putin. And that's because the security threat has been brought home, I speak as a European, to our own continent. President Putin has enunciated a doctrine that he reserves the right to Russia to intervene in other countries if, in his statements, President Putin hasn't limited his ambitions to Ukraine. And there's a real and palpable, I'm sure there'll be some representatives here, young leaders from Baltic countries and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe. There's a real palpable sense that their security, their sovereignty is at risk. So for me, that's a big issue. That's not to say that the threats we face in the Middle East, people in the Middle East face, and we in Western countries face because of conflict and the crisis in the Middle East are not real threats. Of course they are. And we've got a very good minister here who's working on that field, not least because some of those Islamists fighting are British citizens who may well return to Britain and bring with them a war-hardened agenda of violence. But, you know, I speak as a politician from a country that lived through 30 years of terrorist violence to do with the governance of Northern Ireland. That doesn't provide an existential threat to our state, to our country. What President Putin represents, I believe, is an existential threat, at least to members of the alliance closer to Russia than the United Kingdom. So that's the greatest threat. For me, the greatest challenge as a parliamentarian interested in NATO's affairs is to get NATO to better explain its message to the public. I recently wrote a pamphlet, Why NATO Matters, and that for me is a central question. Over my 20 years or so in Parliament, the public mood in Britain has changed. 20 years ago, most people felt that foreign affairs and security decisions ought to be taken by ministers and ambassadors and advised by people from think tanks who understood these difficult technical issues. After Afghanistan and Iraq, everybody has an opinion, and they want their opinion to be heard. And politics is therefore very much more a two-way traffic of ideas. And if we want to maintain support for our alliance, we have to explain why it is important and why it benefits people in our countries that our governments are part of a multinational security initiative.
Thank you. Ming, what do you see as the greatest challenge?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say how much pleasure I have in being here, particularly under the chairmanship of Fran Burwell, who's an old friend and whose judgment and expertise I have always admired. My colleagues have been quite conceptual. I hope you forgive me if I'm a little more pragmatic. Just to pick up on the point which Hugh Bailey has just made about explaining ourselves to our publics. We've just been to a school, about 5-10 miles away from here. Bright, intelligent, well-informed pupils told us that they'd heard of NATO before it was decided that NATO should come to Newport, but they did not have the slightest idea of what NATO was about. And so if we're going to carry out this exercise of ensuring that the public understands, then perhaps the best place to start is with young people, so that as part of their understanding of current affairs, of civic society, all of that. They understand the importance of our alliance. Now, it seems to me there's a particular reason for ensuring that people do understand what the alliance is about, and also the risks which are involved. Because, of course, one of the consequences of the fact that after the Cold War, or rather before and during the Cold War, the challenges were pretty obvious. Russian tank commanders used to say, we can get through the Fulda Gap and we can be in the Channel ports in 48 hours. And that's what produced the doctrine, the nuclear doctrine of flexible response, in which the Allies, because of the overwhelming conventional, or perceived overwhelming conventional superiority of the Warsaw Pact, would actually have been the first to introduce a nuclear dimension to any conflict. Now, it seems to me that we've got through all that. The war came down. People talked about the peace dividend. People said the peace dividend, don't worry about the money, the dividend is the peace itself. But a consequence of that has been to create an atmosphere of risk aversion in which the public is averse to risk. And I mean, it's curious to think about this. It's 100 years since the anniversary of the beginning of the First World War. Just go back and look at the casualty lists and see the extent to which risk averseness has come to dominate thinking. Now, you may say rightly, there should be no unreasonable risks, no untoward risks. But of course, if risk averseness becomes sufficiently embedded, then it means you will never take the action which you want to take. And if that's in the mind of the public, then you can be sure as hell it will be in the mind of the politicians. Because politicians, of course, always respond to public opinion. Although they may deny it, the truth is they always do. And let me just segue out of that into this. And it's the question really of the role of parliamentarians and young leaders, and not so young leaders. There's continuing on, and there will be again. It's explained very, very fervently, sometimes very trenchantly by our American colleagues. You cannot expect us to go on bearing the burden of European defence to the extent that we have, for a whole variety of reasons. Some of them are budgetary, some of them are about the rebalancing of their relationship to the East. But they say Europe must do more. And so we've hit upon 2%. It's a pretty arbitrary figure. And I've no doubt you've heard about it, and you'll hear about it more. Who is responsible for getting all of the countries, all of the members to the 2%? It's not just governments, it's parliamentarians and leaders of the community. And it's a recognition, therefore, at our level, parliamentarian level and at leadership level below that of government, that is the only way in which public opinion in all of the countries is going to be persuaded, not that it's desirable, but that it is essential. And against that, we've already heard very eloquently from both Hugh and Tobias, the nature of the threat. It is of a more expansionist Russia. I mean, those who know their history will know in the 19th century, that's exactly what they were up to. It's part of, if you've ever read John Buchan's novel, Green Mantle, it's about the great game. It's about Russia's effort to get influence over India and hence over Asia. It is in their DNA, and it's resurrected itself in a very acute way. Well, we have to meet that. And one of the best ways in which we meet, not only militarily, but politically, is by showing that we're willing to pay the price. And the price is the strength and the resilience of NATO.
Thanks very much. I would just point out, though, that we've had the 2% for a while, actually. This is a recommitment, if I understand it. And so I think you raise a very interesting question about whether this time around we can get those countries who have been reluctant to come to that level, have the perceptions changed enough so that that will happen. And I'd like to open it to the floor now for questions and comments to our delegates here, and we may bring in some of the other parliamentarians. We can talk both about the perceptions and what we've been talking about up here, but other questions that you may have for them about the parliamentary view of the alliance. Yes. And wait for the mic and say who you are.
Thank you very much. My name is Vasile Rotaru. I am from Republic of Moldova. Because you mentioned the main problem being Russia and its policy towards these Eastern European countries, I would like to ask you, how should NATO deal with these countries, with Moldova, with Ukraine, with Georgia? Should it promise kind of membership? Should it better declare them major non-NATO allies? And what would that imply? What would be the best solution maybe for the moment? Thank you.
I think it was directed at me. I visited your country, met your Prime Minister, your President in July to talk about your country's security fears and risks. The decisions about whether you should seek EU membership or NATO membership are for you to make. It's not for us to go to recruit. This is one of the Russian myths, that NATO has been forever trying to recruit further allies closer and closer to their border. That's not the case. We've responded to requests from countries that were formerly under the Kremlin's sphere of influence, who wanted to break free and to gain security. When I came back from Moldova, I immediately got in touch with the British Foreign Secretary and said, here is a country that is fearful of a big neighbour, a near neighbour, and seeking to strengthen its ties and relationship with the rest of Europe. EU's just signed an association agreement, but it doesn't kick in until the autumn. I think it actually kicked in 2 days ago, on the 1st of September. So I was urging that the European Union in particular should be able to demonstrate a hand of friendship and a quick dividend, a quick economic dividend for Moldova, because there are people who understandably feel cowed and think perhaps Moldova should keep its head down and then Russia will stay away. It's an understandable point of view, but the majority in Moldova seem to say, well, we want to join more fully the Western family of nations. So my message to people in the West is very much a political message, that we should reciprocate and make sure we do enough reciprocating that it seems right on the streets in Moldova. It seems the case that the hand of friendship you've put out towards the West is being reciprocated. I think that's the single most important thing. Perhaps it's worth saying our alliance is not just about tanks and bombs, as my colleague Madeleine Moon was saying in the school this morning. It's a political alliance, and we have economic responsibilities. It's because it's time for me to stop. But
let me put a sharper spin on.
If I may add something, Georgia declared its intention to become a NATO member.
Yeah.
Right.
What should member do in this situation?
Exactly. I mean, these countries that have been mentioned have security issues. There's no way around that. And what should the alliance do? Should we be thinking about putting them on a very serious and overt track towards membership? President Putin has made clear that that is not something that he favors. And would we be willing to extend to those countries? At what point would we be willing to extend to those countries the type of guarantees that President Obama voiced so well in Estonia yesterday? So,
Well,
and I don't know if you want to bring
I agree with everything that you said. Let me just say very shortly. NATO's door should always be open to countries who wish to make application to join. Countries that wish to make application to join have got to bring a bottom to the party. That's to say, their presence will increase the collective security, because such is the nature of an alliance of this kind that you cannot afford, as it were, to introduce countries which, and I put this rather provocatively perhaps, are a liability. They must also demonstrate that their adherence to democracy, the rule of law and human rights is unchallengeable. And the other side of it is that NATO collectively has got to be willing to accept that by admitting any fresh member, it is willing to extend the Article 5 obligation and, if necessary, to go to the assistance of any country, whether an existing member or a recently joined member, in the event of any military attack against that member. These are substantial obligations, but so long as they are able to be met, then NATO's door must remain open.
I was going to invite the chairman of the Defence Select Committee to put him on the spot and whether he had any thoughts on NATO, general NATO expansion.
I mean, I guess, as you'd be aware, the central issue that we're
Mike.
facing, the central problem that we're facing is essentially how we balance the practical question of whether we can or cannot defend new member states against the aspiration of NATO to provide a safe democratic space in which countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have genuinely flourished. I mean, one of the great civilizational achievements, one of the things we should be most proud of over the last 20 years, is that we've allowed not just the Baltic states, but states like Poland to be able to develop without being threatened by a neighbor. So there's a great idealistic, generous impulse to extend that to other countries. But of course, as Russia pushes our resolve, we're being forced to confront the fact that we would face a significant challenge defending our Article 5 commitments to the Baltic states. And I think there would be many military strategists who would be very concerned about the implications of taking on more neighbors. We relied on a theory of deterrence, which was meant to mean that people like Putin didn't push the boundaries of the world order, didn't expand their own territory by force. And that notion of deterrence, the credibility of our deterrence, is now under threat.
Thank you. I saw a question back here. So let's get, can we have a mic? Come on, guys, let's get a mic to her. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Claire York from the United Kingdom, and just wanted to say, totally agree that we need to be reaching out much more to the public, and something that we had in the report we did was also this idea of young people and engaging them. And since the report was launched, we've done a series of Twitter debates at Future NATO, and one of the very common themes that came out in this is actually the message isn't always clear on NATO. Do people know what NATO is about in the modern day? So it's not just about the audience and who we reach out to, but also the message. Do you think it's a fair assessment that actually we're not entirely clear what NATO means in the modern day? And what do you think the core message would be if you would give us a soundbite?
So when you go back to your constituents and you say we're thinking about expanding membership or NATO is going to protect the Baltics, how do you say it? Do you think they understand this idea that your soldiers may go to war and under those circumstances?
If we posed it solely, in the UK, solely in terms of security for other countries, people wouldn't understand it. So I have to explain to people in Britain why membership of NATO makes us British citizens in the UK more secure, and you have to do the same in each of your own countries. So I would say very simply in the UK, for a middle-sized country, is a big hitter, the fifth biggest defence budget in the world. What does that buy us? It buys us 19 warships, not enough to do an anti-piracy operation off the Horn of Africa on our own. What do all 28 members of NATO bring to us? 267, I think, surface ships. Look at the submarines, look at the tanks. We have a couple of hundred. NATO has 5,000 or 6,000. I must do my arithmetic properly. So I say, even though we're a big hitter, we, the UK, haven't got the resources to defend our country unless we have friends who we can call on in time of need to help us. But the price of getting that help when we need it in the UK, when our sea lanes are threatened, is that we have to stand by them when their sovereignty is threatened.
So, okay. Could we have, yes, let me bring in this side of the room.
Hi, my name is Patrick Maldre from Estonia. First of all, I want to say that Britain has played a very strong role in reassuring the Baltics, so I want to thank you for that and your role in that. Britain has gone to war and helped Estonia gain independence in 1921 as well, so your reassurance measures now are just as appreciated as your role was in helping us gain independence. But I want to ask about defense spending in particular, and it was a compelling point for me that parliamentarians, of course, have a major role to play in that, And much more often we think about governments and heads of government as playing the most important role in that. Parliamentarians, of course, and a majority in parliament makes that decision in almost all of our countries. So how can you engage other members of your own parliament? How can you engage parliamentarians in other countries as members of parliament in Britain to help increase defense spending in many of our allied countries? Thank you.
Since I had a bite at that, could I ask my colleague Madeleine Moon to respond on the question of how we get the money?
Again, it's about making sure that the populations of each country understand what it is they're being asked to pay for. And it's about extending that understanding of what NATO is and what it brings to their own personal security. I take the idea of reaching out very seriously. So my local newspaper today is carrying an article about what this conference is about, what NATO is about. I have a public meeting planned in 2 months' time, which Ming and Hugh are coming to talk to people in my constituency about what NATO is and answer questions. I'm going into every one of my schools, telling them about NATO and doing a question and answer session about NATO. Every one of us has got to be able to go back to their country and say, you need to spend this money. And I know you want money for schools. I know you want money for health. I know you want money for roads. But you really need to spend the money on this, and it has to be a priority. And it's only when the message comes bottom up that governments feel confident in actually doing that, I think.
Any of the others of you want to comment on this? No. I saw a hand back there. Let's get these two right here.
Hi, Michaela Dacha at Heritage Foundation. Where do you see the greatest synergy to be had between NATO's communication and your efforts as parliamentarians? And I would also like to point out, or rather react, I think that now is not the time to have a debate whether NATO or whether old members of NATO can extend security to new members of NATO. That, time for the discussion was about over 10 years ago. But now NATO must show that it has strong commitment to security of its newer members.
And then just in front.
From the first comment, when you mentioned that Ukraine or Russia is an existential problem, but not Middle East, I want to take that part. Should we really separate Russian problem from the crisis that we see in the Middle East? Because when I look at the Middle East from Arab Spring onwards, we see Russia in Libya, for instance, they did not back up the UN resolution 1973. And then we see Syrian use of chemical weapons. They come up with the idea, and we thought that they were kind of helping the West with solutions. Actually, probably they were preventing from a military involvement with the West, and they are helping also Iran as well. So how much do you think the Russian influence in the Middle East is going through for these crises? And can we really separate the two issues?
So let me ask you first, since they were quite different questions, to say what you think as parliamentarians about the role that NATO public diplomacy might play in Britain. And I know that sometimes NATO, particularly when we had new countries coming into the alliance, NATO public diplomacy has played a key role. There are other countries in the alliance who are less enthusiastic about that. They want to do it themselves. But what would you like to see from the alliance that would be helpful to you in reaching out to your constituents?
More openness, more transparency, more information. People need to know what NATO is, what it does, and how it spends their money, if you want them to support it. We as a parliament have been pressing the North Atlantic Council to publish its accounts and audit statements on those accounts, which it's never done hitherto. It's just published its first set of accounts. It's agreed that the default is to publish. I mean, one understands that there may occasionally be security matters which can't be put in the public domain, but I think that that's the greatest single help that NATO can give to parliamentarians and to civil society, people like you, to make the case for the alliance.
Very quickly on the first question, the second half of it, if I may. I don't think these are mutually exclusive alternatives. I think they can be part of the same profile, being strong and resolute and determined, and also being open to the admission to NATO of countries who are going to assist that determination. That seems to me, we shouldn't see these as at the expense of each other. And on the continued and rather vexed question of how we engage with Russia, Russia has an interest in the Middle East. One of the reasons it's got an interest in the Middle East is there's a Chechen unit as part of ISIS. And where will they go if they're driven out? They'll go back to Mother Russia and create a very substantial volume of problems for Mr. Putin. And so they have an interest. Now, how you engage with that interest without prejudicing your other positions is, of course, a very difficult thing to do. But look at the history of diplomacy. Somehow we've managed to do that pretty often in the past.
Could I ask you to speak more about the Middle East and NATO? I mean, because that is a connection that it seems to me that we, in some conversations that I had in London earlier this week, it seemed like Britain was almost focused more on the Middle East and Iraq, and for obvious reasons on the recent tragedies there, rather than Ukraine almost. And I wondered if you could build a link between, or say what more the role of what NATO is in the Middle East and that general set of issues.
I mean, NATO is that vehicle of promoting stability in an insecure world, is that military capability to be able to provide a utility which perhaps other international agencies cannot do. The challenge that we find today, compared with when it fits in with the mindset of what NATO actually is to the public, when it was first created, it was the strength of its alliance was its ability to make decisions very quickly and to react. Today, we have other agencies that were never designed to do crisis. The EU was never designed as an organization to do crisis. When Crimea took place, it was the EU that had to get together to work out the sanctions. And that's quite right. That's the organization that should be debating those things. But to gain the consensus, every time consensus was then gained, or just before it, Putin would throw another spanner in the works, and then we'd have to get around the table all over again in order to work out what's going on. That is the price of democracy that you actually pay. And then NATO, which is sort of sitting behind that and is waiting for the decisions and judgments, and asking ourselves, how does this fit in with the Middle East? It is, what is our actual strategy for the Middle East? We can be invited, in the case of Iraq, to provide military support, and that is one option that may be presented to us, and then NATO can actually act. In the case of Syria, it would be illegal to do that unless we had a UN mandate in order to do so. Only then can NATO move forward in providing some support, were it to be actually NATO. But then the other question that you then have is, and we talk of 2%, is even if you are meeting your 2%, do you turn up for the fight? And we've had situations whereby countries are meeting their markers, but then actually when they are called to arms, it's left wanting. And ironically, it's some of our partnership nations that then step up to the plate as well. So these are difficult questions, and I'm pleased to see that during the summit there is one part of the program which is about NATO's relationship with these other organizations, the UN, the EU, and others, the World Bank, IMF, and how they can all work together in a more comprehensive and efficient manner to make sure that the strategy, or whatever it might be, can actually manifest itself into a result.
Thank you. I think I could see, when you start talking about the broader regional engagement of NATO and our work with partners, but also such things as burden sharing. These are all issues that certainly strike a chord or don't strike a chord, and that may be the problem with the public. And I think there's a lot more we could talk about. We unfortunately have to bring this to a close. But I just want to underscore for everyone the role, I think, of parliaments in trying to make clear what NATO is and why it's so important as we go ahead. Because I think, as you said, there was this peace dividend. There was this time when people didn't think about it. But now, foreign policy is conducted by the publics in many ways. And unless we learn to work with that, it will be an even greater challenge in the future.
Can I just invite Mike Gapes to say a word of thanks for us being here and to put him on the spot? Sorry, but just to then articulate.
Yes, and just to say briefly, a point was made about Russia. Russia is clearly going back to the 19th century in its approach to international institutions. And this presents us all with a major challenge. And we need to recognise that Russia has a role because it's a permanent member of the Security Council for good or ill, and normally for ill at the moment. And we have to deal with it at both levels. And that's a short answer to the question that was asked. I want to thank you all so much for being here with us today. We could be, I suspect, here for a whole day or even 2 or 3. There are lots of questions that I'm sure people wanted to ask that didn't get a chance. And certainly all my colleagues will have wanted to enlarge upon the answers that were given, as we are parliamentarians. And can I thank the hosts of the meeting today, and also you as the participants who are making this meeting possible. We're having a fantastic visit here in Newport already, but sadly we've got to go on to another engagement. I think we're going on to a ship in the next episode of our journey around here. So thank you very much, and we wish you all the best in the future.